have some announcements to make before I introduce our speaker. Actually, I'm reading this one. If you're an ASHA member watching remotely via webcast, CEUs are not available through Penn State or Patton. As an attendee of the webcast, you may print a copy of your attendance certificate and submit that certificate to ASHA certification directly for contact maintenance hours. If you are in the audience, please submit the bubble sheet per the conference directions prior to leaving the conference. Some other announcements that I have, our exhibit hall will be open till 5:15 today, so make sure you get a chance to get over there. Between 4:30 and 6 o'clock, there will be a panel discussion here, just talking about the perspectives on the importance of behavior analysis and working with students who are on the autism spectrum. Make sure you complete your CEU forms and turn those in before you leave. And any PowerPoints or handouts will be on the wpsu app. If you haven't downloaded that yet, all the instructions are in your folder in order to do that. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Eileen Schwartz. She is a professor and chair in the area of special education at the University of Washington and the director of Hearing Care Center for Research and Training in Education at UW. She earned her PhD in Child and Developmental Psychology from the University of Kansas and is a board-certified behavior analyst. Dr. Schwartz has an active research and professional training agenda with primary interest in the area of autism, inclusive education, and the sustainability of educational interventions. She has had consistent funding from the U.S. Department of Education since 1990 and serves on a number of editorial review boards, including the Topics in Early Childhood Special Education and the Journal of Early Intervention. Dr. Schwartz is the director of Project Data, a model preschool program for children with autism that has been in operation since 1997 and is currently involved in research projects examining the efficacy of Project Data model with toddlers and preschoolers with autism. Let's welcome her.
Well, thank you, Janet, for that nice introduction, and thank you to all of you who are here this afternoon, this sunny afternoon in Pennsylvania. So I just heard from Laura Yates, one of the conference organizers, that there are 1,400 people at this conference. So that's amazing, and I'm happy that many of you have chosen to spend your afternoon with me. So let me start by telling you that you're going to need two things to participate in this presentation today. You're going to need to be able to talk to someone. So if you're sitting by yourself, you need to say hello to someone near you or move so that there's someone near you, because you're going to need to be engaging in discussion with someone. Now, I say this as the student who, if I had been in school at the time when group activities had been more popular, I would have been really unhappy. But I'm not anymore, so I'm going to make you guys do that. And then the other thing is, if you have a device with you and you have not yet downloaded the the professional and ethical compliance code from the BACB, which was one of your handouts today, do that now, because you're going to need to refer to that in part of our presentation. So I'll let you have a few minutes to do that while I'm kind of just doing some introductory work here. And also, just for those of you that are planners, and we all work with, most of us here work with people with autism, and they always say that people with autism love to have schedules, and I just think that's ridiculous, because we all really love to have schedules. So just to let you know that we will have a break somewhere in between. I'm not exactly sure when, but we will have a break. So let's start by just kind of talking about the objectives for this presentation. First of all, I imagine, how many of you in the room are BCBAs, BCABAs, RBTs, some form? Okay, I figured most of you are, because why you would come and talk about ethics given the rest of the amazing topics on the docket this afternoon if you didn't need those ethics CEUs, or just because I think it's a really fascinating topic, but kind of not so much if you're not really a BCBA, if you're not a BCBA or some variation thereof, because every organization has its own ethical code. And so if you're going to learn about the ethical code of the BACB, it makes sense that you are somehow certified by them. So some of our objectives for today are that we're going to talk about the shift in the BACB code from guidance to compliance, because that's a really important shift. And for some people that kind of went by and we didn't really think much about it except the title of the code changed. And I would like to suggest that it's actually more important than that. And then I want us to talk a little, just briefly, about some other historical approaches to ethics, because people have been studying ethics since I think there were people, and there are many, many approaches to how we think about ethics. And again, I think some of us forget that when we just see the code that comes out in the BACB and the updated missives that they send us in the newsletters, and we forget that there's a huge body of people out there who really do study ethics as a profession, and that we should be thinking about that. We want to then propose an ethical decision-making process as a way of thinking about how we make decisions about ethics. When I say we, I'm mainly referring to my colleague Nancy Rosenberg. I need to shout her out because she and I have done most of this work on ethics together. But we believe that when we make decisions about ethics, ethics are not, ethics are just how we live our moral life, how we run our day-to-day lives. And we talk about ethics as ethical dilemmas as being dilemmas that are right versus right dilemmas. They're not right versus wrong dilemmas. So, for example, I saw an ad came across my email the other day about the ethical dilemmas of insurance fraud, the webinar that a well-known behavior analyst was going to be presenting. And I said, there are no ethical dilemmas of insurance fraud. Insurance fraud is a crime. It's not an ethical question. So when I think about ethical dilemmas, I think about, things like how do I handle competing contingencies in the school district where I work? Or what do I do when I really believe a child needs this, but the family really is insisting that we do that? Those, to me, are ethical dilemmas. When laws are broken, those are not ethical dilemmas. So we need to keep that in mind. We're going to practice on a few cases, talking about this, using this ethical decision-making code, and that's why I need you to be able to talk to some people near you, and why it will be helpful if you have the ethical code near you. And then we're going to do a deep dive. This is a kind of a new part of my presentation that I've never actually done before, that we're going to do a deep dive into one code of the professional and ethical compliance code, because again, one of the things that we need to be doing is making sure that we view this ethical compliance code, professional ethical compliance code, as a living document. That's something that we're continually learning from, referring to, studying, and we're going to try and do some of that this afternoon as well. So first, a little about me, my favorite topic, of course, just so that you can have the context from where I stand. And we know that context is important in determining how any of us see a problem or an issue, and how we make an interpretation about that problem or issue. So I've been working with children with autism since 1978. I've been at the University of Washington since 1991. I told one of my classes that last spring that I've been there since 1991, and they got this horrible look. Most of them got this horrible look on their face, and I realized most of you weren't born then, right? And they're like, right. And I was like, okay, 2 martinis tonight when I get home. But, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and the interesting thing to me is that I know that many of you have been doing this for a long time as well, and one of the really fascinating things that we've seen is that this field of applied behavior analysis that many of us love and have been devoted to for our professional lives has changed dramatically. And the fact that we now have an ethical code is good evidence of that. We're going to talk about that too. But some other things about my practice with children with autism, and although I've worked across my lifetime with people with autism of all ages, I say children with autism because I primarily work with toddlers and preschool children with autism. But I understand that and applaud everyone here that works with people with autism of all ages. And I think the next big wave for all of us that are providing appropriate services for adults with autism and behavioral gerontology. That's where the ticket right now. So anyway, that's a weird aside. Anyway, but I believe that children with autism are children first. And the reason I say that, and what I mean by that, is that when we think about what we need to do for children with autism in terms of treatment, placement, materials that we use, how we talk to them, we need to think about what would this child be doing if they didn't have autism. So we think about, so I have a 4-year-old who has 2 older brothers, they live, you know, where do they live? What kind of activities does their family do together? How do they eat their meals? What do they do? Do they have a spiritual belief or ritual that they engage in? What kind of things does this child need to be doing to be part of that family? And those are all things that are going to influence my practice. I have a close friend who works in Montana, and so she works in some really rural areas. I mainly work in urban and suburban places in Seattle, but she'll tell me about, you know, she's working with kids who live on reservations and that they have to, you know, participate in these very large activities, long dinners that everyone on the reservation goes to. And if that's the value for the family, then that's one of the things we need to be teaching, okay? And not ignore it and say, sorry, it's not on the ABLES, I'm not going to teach that. So this idea of children with autism are children first reminds us not just how we treat them, but also about the curriculum that we're going to engage in. The second thing is that despite the fact that I've been a behavior analyst for more than half my life, I believe that there's no one right way to educate children with autism. I wish that I could tell you, here's the curriculum, do this, and everyone will be fine. I wish I could do that because I believe that parents of children with autism are my superheroes because they walk the walk 24/7. But there is no one right way. We know that behavior analysis is the most effective demonstrated way to work with kids with autism, but there are still kids with autism who receive lots and lots of behavioral services and still have intense support needs. And so we need to be open-minded in how we think about the components that go into any intervention program for a person with autism. I also believe that educating children with autism is a team sport. You know, Hillary Clinton said it takes a village to raise a child, or she took that from a old proverb, and I would argue it takes an entire metropolitan area to raise a child with autism. So, and we know that no one discipline and no one person can do it alone. And I believe also that ethics is a team sport. And what I mean by that is that you need a sounding board. We learn more about this complex idea of what is right and wrong and how our actions are perceived by others when we talk about our actions with others. It's a very hard thing to do alone, and I'll refer to this topic later, but I'll spoil my own thunder now. That one of the authors that we read a lot and we like his work very much is a man named Rushworth Kidder, and he wrote an incredible book about ethics that I would encourage you all to read. And he talks about the idea of engaging in ethical fitness. And this is a metaphor that makes great sense to me. So he says, just as in physical fitness, where we practice every day, we train every day, so that when we need to run the race, or we just need to end up walking up 10 flights of stairs because the elevator is broken, that we're in shape to do that. And in ethical fitness, it's the same idea, that you need to be practicing all the time. That is, you need to be talking about the code, you need to be aware of the code, you need to be talking about issues with your clients. So when a really hard issue hits, it isn't like, well, I know the code's on somewhere on my laptop, but I don't really know. I think there's something in there about, you know, multiple relationships. I don't really know what it says. That you're familiar enough with it that you can actually make a decision when you need to. So this idea of thinking of it as an ongoing practice is something that I feel I'm quite committed to. Okay, most of you have probably seen this graph. This graph comes from Autism Speaks, and this graph just goes to show that there's an ongoing increase in children with autism. Most of you probably know that the CDC came out with new numbers this year that says that the prevalence of autism is 1 in 59. This only goes back to 2004, but if we extended that graph out more, when I first started working with children with autism, we talked about the prevalence of autism being 3 to 5 in 10,000, so that now it's it's 1 in 59, which means that if you are in an elementary school of 300 children, and there are natural proportions in that school, there should be 5 or 6 kids with autism in that school. So autism is, even though we still talk about it as a low incidence disability, it is in no means a low incidence disability. So that means that those of us as behavior analysts need to be thinking about how we talk to other people about working with people with autism, interacting with people with autism, because as much as the number of behavior analysts is increasing, it's not keeping up with the demand. In addition, the one great entitlement that every child in the United States has is their public education. So we need to make sure that we're working with those teams of people who are providing that public education to make sure that children with autism are receiving the promise of IDEA, which is a free and appropriate public education. So finally, after all of that intro, I'm going to start getting into the history of the BACB ethical code. So you know that from 2000, the ethical code was first written in 2001, and from 2001 until 2015, we had the BACB guidelines for responsible conduct for behavior analysts. So think about what guidelines mean. Guidelines mean, yeah, you should do this. It's a good idea. You know, if you veer from the guidelines, there's no consequence from that. You know, you can combine guidelines with anything else you feel like, but, you know, guidelines are what they are. They're guidelines. But then in 2016, the rules literally changed. And in 2016, the BACB published the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts. So think about the word compliance versus the word guidelines, okay? So compliance has a pretty legalistic term, right? We as many of us as behavior analysts spend long times every day working on compliance with our clients, right? And we often think, you know, when we think about working on compliance with our clients, we think about two things. One is we think about, do they know how to comply? And then the other part is, are they motivated to comply? And a third thing is, are there interfering variables that make compliance challenging? Okay, so let's think about that for us as well. Okay, do we know how to comply? Well, all of us who are certified have taken a compliance course. Okay, now as a college professor, I in no way kid myself that just because you've taken a course means that you know anything. So sorry. Like, I used to believe that more, but you know, I know. I believe we're motivated to comply because I think that most of us are doing behavior analysis or engaged in behavior analysis because we really want to do good work. But so then what's the hang up when it happens? So I think it has to be this other thing, the things that interfere with compliance. So this shift from guidance to compliance, you know, has a couple things that, you know, are important to pull up. So so first, in the old set of guidelines, the word guidelines appears 41 times. Okay, they're clear that you know it's a guideline. In the new title, the word guideline doesn't appear at all. They're very clear about that this is a compliance code, okay? There's a huge shift in language. The old language, we talk about, you know, under these guidelines, you know, that we want to make sure that that behavior analysts have a commitment to these guidelines. In the new code, we talk about that they want behavior analysts to know that the code will take steps to resolve conflict. So the code kind of becomes the stand-in for the man. And it talks about the fact that the code will be enforced. Okay? So the guidelines seemed like they were kind of, is this a good idea? The code seems very much like this is not just the rule, this is the law. And this gets us right into the issue of enforceability. That in the old code, it talks about that the guidelines are provided for general reference to practitioners, that these guidelines are not separately enforced by the BACB. And in the new code, it says the code will be enforceable in its own right and in its entirety. So again, it takes this idea of we are a group of professionals who are working together to make sure that we're providing the best possible services to our clients, including many people who have autism, to these are the rules and you will follow them. Okay? Now, when we have rules about how to do something, this gives us this implicit assumption. So if we have a set of rules, whether it's for how to put together an IKEA table or how to implement behavioral services for a person with a disability, it assumes that it's the right way to do it in all circumstances. It also makes this assumption that ethical behavior can best be achieved by policing adherence to that set of rules. That this is the right way to do it, and the best way as a profession that we can get people to be more compliant, more ethical in their behavior is to say, you must do it this way, and if you don't do it this way, we're going to, there are consequences for that. And this is an approach to ethics that we call rule-based ethics or deontology. And, you know, the thing is that we always know that there is always a time, you know, when we study ethics more deeply, we know that there are times when, you know, you would say, yeah, I'm going to break a rule. Now's the time to break a rule. So let's use a very simple example. So if the example is, I do not tell a lie, and that's probably a lesson that most of us have learned from early on. I do not tell a lie. So are there ever times when you do tell a lie? Yeah, your best friend comes in wearing an absolutely hideous shirt and says, do you love my shirt? And you can tell she's very excited about it. And you say, not so much. Most of us wouldn't do that. Most of us would say, wow, it's a great color. Or interesting shape. Or something. But we wouldn't say, that's hideous. Now, my sister-in-law does, interestingly. And all three of my nieces and I have a little PTSD about going shopping with her. And we all kind of joke about it, you know, because it's like none of us want to go shopping with her because it's like, she's a little too honest. But there are times when it is okay to think about breaking a rule. And a code of compliance does not give us as professionals that leeway. Now, there's another set of rules, another way of thinking about ethics, and Kant in 1785 really talked about that. And he talked about rule-based ethics, which is what the BACB does. He says, the morality of an action is determined by its adherence to a rule. If you follow the rule, you're moral. If you don't follow the rule, you're not moral. So if the rule is thou shalt not kill, and someone is going to kill your child and you kill them instead, you are not a moral person. Okay? Now, I know it's an extreme case, but that's moral-based rules. But the potential, there are lots of potential problems with this kind of rule-based ethics. The first of them is that two or more rules can conflict. Okay, so one is we don't, and we see this all the time in the code. There are many, many items in the code that conflict. You should never discriminate against people based on on many areas, but then you also shouldn't work with clients who are outside of your boundaries of competence. And so those two may conflict. What do you do? Okay. Context can also suggest an ethical course counter to the rule. Okay, so again, I spend a lot of time working in schools. And at what point do I say, you know, I think it's more important that this child work on their social emotional relationships here than I implement this very strict but isolating behavioral intervention program. Okay, how do I manage those things? And then this is a huge one that everyone who works with the code deals with, and that is that cultural considerations can suggest an ethical course counter to the rule. So I'm not going to even talk about accepting gifts. If you know, like we all know that it's okay to accept a cup of tea, even though the code says it's not. There's a great article by Matt Broadhead that I'm happy to share the reference with you if you want to have more discussion about that. But as my Jewish grandmother would tell me, is that when someone comes to your house, whether they're there to fix your barbecue or have a meeting, you offer them a beverage. And it's not a gift, it's a common courtesy. And so some things like that, just my culture does not allow me to have someone come into my home, even as a service provider, and not make that offer. So we have to think about those issues. I think about, I'll tell you my own story of violating that code. I was with a brand new master's student, and she was finishing up her master's program, but she was like 2 weeks into the ethics course in our program. And we went to go visit a family that was just starting to work with us, and this family had a 2-year-old with autism, just diagnosed, very nervous, very, very nervous. And we went to meet with them for the very first time, and the moms, there's 5 of us in the room, basically the mom, the student, me, the child, and then fortunately for this family, their housekeeper. So there were 5 of us there. So the mom says to me and the student, can I get you a cup of coffee? And the student's like, no. And I said, oh, no, thanks, I'm fine. She goes, really? Are you sure I can't get you a cup of coffee? And I said, I'd love one. That'd be great. She goes, great. And then her housekeeper brought us both cups of coffee. And on the way out of the house, the student said to me, I cannot believe you accept a cup of coffee. And I said, did you see how the mom's demeanor changed as soon as I accepted that cup of coffee? She calmed down and we got to work. We had a 2-hour meeting. It was awesome. But before then, she was just she was a Twitter. She couldn't focus. So, yes, I said I did that. Both the context and the cultural consideration told me it was the right thing to do. Okay, so here are some examples of rules that conflict. So behavior analysts, code 1.05F, so those of you that are following along in your own copy of the Professional Ethical Consulting Compliance Code can follow along. Behavior analysts refrain from providing services when their personal circumstances may compromise delivering services to their best of their abilities. And 1.04C is behavior analysts follow through on obligations, contractual, professional commitments with high quality work. Okay, well, what do you do if you have a whole slate of clients and something happens, like your mother is diagnosed with breast cancer, or you're going through a very unpleasant divorce and you're really not available to do those things? So those codes conflict. You have to make a decision. You can't do both. So, okay. So here we're going to talk about some context, where the context matters, okay? I get ahead of myself. That's what happens when I don't read my notes. Okay, so consider this is one we're going to talk about where context matters. So consider a behavior analyst named Clarice living in a small university town, maybe like State College. Clarice's 3-year-old daughter is diagnosed with developmental delay and is exhibiting self-injurious behavior. At the local university, there is a behavior analyst who has significant expertise in self-injurious behavior. Unfortunately, this professor is also Claire's former professor and has since become Clarice's friend and colleague. Clearly, for Clarice's child to receive services from this behavior analyst constitutes a multiple relationship because they're friends. But this is a complicated situation. Is it right that Clarice should have to forego the expertise of a clear expert in her child's presenting problem because this person happens to be a friend and colleague? Is it possible to set up the situation to avoid potential issues caused by this multiple relationship? Oops, sorry. So you can see that there is an example of where the context matters. I mean, the context matters. It's, of course, Clarice should go to this expert, and I think the expert would say, of course, I will work with you to develop an intervention for your child. So there's a clear example of where what we might want to do violates what the code says. And now let's talk about a time that culture matters, or as we like to say, culture always matters. So behavior analysts rely on professionally derived knowledge based on science. Clients have a right to effective treatment based on the research literature, etc. So think about a family who wants to try a non-scientifically supported treatment popular in their culture that has enjoyed favorable reports in the press. So anyone, I'm sure you can all think of something, but let's just use the example of cupping. So cupping, which is something that was not that popular until Michael Phelps started doing it, and now everyone does it, was something that was often done in Southeast Asian cultures. And in fact, there are many reports of parents from Southeast Asian cultures being reported to CPS because of the marks from cupping on their children's back. So the behavior analyst believes this treatment would be harmful, it would take very little time, and that agreeing would greatly improve the relationship with the family. The behavior analyst also fears that without this collegial approach, the family will decide to abandon ABA altogether. The behavior analyst could reasonably decide after a careful weighing of the consequences that in this situation, deciding to include this non-scientific treatment in a robust package of behavioral interventions is the most ethical course. So we're not saying the behavior analyst is going to begin cupping, but they're also not going to try to talk the family out of it. And I would argue that they should also take data on it, because we don't know that it's effective or not effective. But if it's effective, we should want to know that, okay? So there are some other approaches to making ethical decision making, to ethical decision making, and one's called virtue ethics. So Aristotle, I'm sure we've all heard of Aristotle. This may be the only behavioral intervention, the only behavioral presentation you ever go to where both Kant and Aristotle have been mentioned. So hooray for me. Mainly, again, hooray to Nancy Rosenberg, my colleague. So Aristotle talks about virtue ethics, and he tells us that a commitment to being a good and virtuous person, actually I'm sure he said a good and virtuous man, but we updated it. Ethical decisions are based on what a person decides is most virtuous in a given situation. Each ethical situation is unique and complex, and the contextual factors of each must be considered on their own. So one of the problems, of course, with that kind of situation, that kind of ethical decision making, is that especially as behavior analysts, we have people working with family with relatively little training. So if I think about my colleagues who are BCBAs, I have very little worry about them going out and doing things that would be unethical, not in the interest of the family, that may cause harm. When I think about RBTs who have 40 hours of training, and yes, they get lots of supervision, I have more worries about that. I'm not sure that they know the right thing to do. And so this idea of having some more guidance for people with less professional skill becomes very important. Okay. Yep, sorry. So another kind of ethical decision making is what we call a means and ends-based decision making. That a focus on the potential consequences of different actions in an ethical dilemma. Choose the action that will result in the best outcome for the greatest number. Okay, so how do we help the greatest number of people receive services? What do we do so that the greatest number of children with autism, or the greatest number of people with disabilities, or the greatest number of children overall have the best outcomes? And then another approach, a more modern approach, was actually introduced by Carol Gilligan, where she talked about care-based ethics. And this kind of ethics stresses the uniqueness of the individuals embedded in the relationship. So that you, as an outsider, can't really make a decision about the ethics of a relationship that you're not part of. So she talks about the fact that moral action, which is what ethics is, centers on interpersonal relationships and care as a virtue. That a commitment to act on behalf of persons with whom one has a significant relationship with. So as a caregiver, that really makes it hard, because especially as a professional caregiver, we always think about having some boundaries around the relationship that we have with the people with whom that we care for. So all of these things, all of these ideas just go to show, hopefully, the idea that we've made in this last 45 minutes is that ethics aren't easy, right? You know, when I first started doing more serious study into ethics, you know, I was like, okay, I read the code, and I was left a little cold, to be honest with you. And I said, there's more to it than this. It's not that simple. But as you get into it, it's not only not that simple, it's remarkably complex. And to try to simplify it down to a list of steps and rules becomes challenging. So then we start to think about, how would we help behavior analysts think about ethical decision making? Basically, what steps would a behavior analyst go through when considering an ethical issue? Because for someone to deviate from the published guidelines, the process would expect a person to demonstrate that they've diligently and systematically thought through the issue, weighed carefully the pros and cons of each course of action, and then documented their deliberations, and then made a careful decision, as opposed to saying, well, I was thirsty, so I'm going to take that glass of water, or whatever the issue that they decided to do was. So here's the beginning of how we started thinking about ethical decision making as a process. So the first thing is that we start with a set of guidelines developed by the experts, and we have that. As behavior analysts, we have that. That's the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code. And then that will lead the behavior analyst through clarifying the issue, considering relevant guidelines, considering other factors that might be at play, brainstorming, and eventually evaluating. And then ethical conduct would then be judged by one's ability to stand in front of a court of their peers and defend one's decision-making process, the resolutions for it, and the reasons for it. So if I deviate from this ethical, the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code, such as someone says, you're only supposed to look at behavior analytical interventions, and I, in fact, decide that I'm going to include relaxation for some of my clients, why am I doing that? Is there a reason? Have I considered all of the potential outcomes? What process did I go through to make that decision, and what were my reasons for it? So I like this quote, and I think it gets us to a nice it's a nice segue to kind of this next part of our presentation. So I think we're kind of 1/3 through our presentation. So I think this quote says, treating ethical rules as immutable ends in themselves, separating them from the ethical ideals, that is the principles and virtues that they were designed to reflect and support, can turn them into obstacles rather than facilitators of ethical ideas, such as respect, fairness, caring, beneficence, and avoidance of harm. So when I think about what I want my students to do when I teach and talk to them about compliance, I want them to make sure that they're treating every client with whom they work in their family fairly, with respect, and that they're avoiding harm. And honestly, I care a little bit less about code 5.02F. Now 5.02F is important. I actually don't know what that is, but but I'd have to look it up. But it's important. But sometimes, we lose sight of the big picture, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about now. So this is that book, this is that reference I was telling you about, Rushworth Kidder, How Good People Make Tough Decisions. It's a great book, and I would encourage you, if you're looking for a summer read, I would encourage you to read it. And it's a really fast read. It's not, it's not like trying to read Aristotle. So he says that ethics, after all, is not about what you do because regulation compels it, like paying to ride on a train, or nature compels it. It's about what you ought to do, have an obligation to do, because it is right. Okay, so you pay the bill to you give the person on the ticket when you're riding on the airplane. You give the person your ticket, but when someone leaves their iPhone sitting on the seat and they get up and walk away to deplane, you say to them, "Hey, you forgot is that your iPhone?" That's an ethical issue. right? It's a thing you should do. So here's some food for thought. We see, and we're going to get into our process very, very soon. We see our process as a way to structure and stimulate healthy, ongoing debate and conversation about what makes an ethical behavior analyst. And we say this because we are interested in making sure that the students we turn out practice in an ethical way, and the families and children with whom we have relationships become consumers of people who would treat them the way we would want to be treated. And that, to me, is the final straw. It's a strategy to develop your ethical fitness. Remember, I introduced this term early on. You need to work out frequently and in a functional manner so that when you need to use these skills, you have them. You know, when someone comes up to you and asks a question and you're like, not sure, you know how to do it. Okay, so here's our code, here's our outline that I know you can't see. So I'm going to, I know you can't really read that, but I'm going to go, and this is it in a way that you actually can read it. So here's our process. And this process will soon be published in Behavior Analysis and Practice. So it's just accepted in Behavior Analysis and Practice. So we're going to go through this. We're going to practice it, and then we'll have questions too. So the first step is, why does this trigger my ethical radar? So has it happened to you where someone asks you a question and you think, I'm not sure about that? And we think about, why does that trigger my ethical radar? And then we have to brainstorm solutions. So what else could we do in this situation? Okay? We need to evaluate those solutions. We need to find an acceptable solution. We need to make a decision of all the acceptable solutions. And this is the part that I love, because we are, after all, behavior analysts. Implement it with fidelity and document all actions. So this is kind of like where we are implementing a behavior intervention plan. You know, you come up with all the ideas that you could do, you know, based on the function of the behavior. And then you say, okay, this is the one we're going to do. Let's implement it with fidelity and take data. And then finally, we're going to reflect on the results and evaluate. So here, kind of going through the steps. So why did this trigger my ethical radar? So the first thing you have to do is identify what the ethical dilemma is. And actually, I think it's helpful to think about a challenging behavior as something that we're all used to doing. So, you know, when we think about a challenging behavior, one of the things I always tell my students is that you have to name the behavior. Because at some point, you know, a teacher will come in and say, this kid is driving me crazy. And I say, excellent, thank you for sharing that with me. Not a behavior. So what are they doing? Well, they're just into everything. Once again, thank you for sharing, not a behavior. So when we get them to the point of where they're out of their seat a lot, they're ripping up paper, they're not following directions, they're hitting other people, they're being disrespectful, they're talking when the teacher doesn't want them to talk. Those are all behaviors we can work on, but we need to name the behavior before we can move forward. And in the same way with an ethical dilemma, you need to name it, what's going on. If applicable, we need to identify the client, and this has become more and more difficult for those of us in behavior analysis, especially those of you who work and are billing medical insurance. You know, medical insurance has changed behavior analysis, and some people think it's changed it for the good, and some people think it may have changed it for the bad. But however, it's changed it. And that means that we have to think differently about how we bill and how we define and how we think about behavior. So who is the client? Is the client the child who is receiving the service? Is the client the teacher whom I'm being paid to intervene with? Is the client the behavior analyst I'm training? Is the client the parent? Who is the client? We need to identify the relevant codes. And then it's really important that we identify personal values and biases that may be influencing my decision making. Because again, we all have those personal biases and decision and influences, personal values and biases. And it's better just to call them out up front. So what if it's that you think that people should be served at school, or people should be served at home, or whatever the issue you have is, it's good to call that out. Okay. So now let's talk about things that we need to talk about when we talk about evaluating solutions. So here are some ways that we weigh solutions, and really our next slide really is a case study. So we're going to get to talk, you guys get to talk really soon here. So when we weigh solutions, we want to think about, I think number one, student safety or client safety. Is what we're going to do ensure that the client is safe? Not long after that is client dignity and self-determination. So how is the client, especially when we deal with older clients, but even with little kids, we need to make sure that we're treating the client with dignity. We're treating them in a way we would want our own children or children about whom we care a lot about to be treated. And that when possible, we let the person in the situation have a voice about what we do, okay? Let me give you an example about how little we do this. I have an amazing doc student who just finished. Actually, she's not, I guess as of a month ago, she was no longer my doc student. But she did this amazing dissertation where she's been really interested in student voice and student dignity. And so she was working with students who had challenging behaviors. She went in and worked with their school teams. They did FBAs. And then with the teachers, she identified like 4 or 5 function-based interventions that she thought that they all thought would be effective, and that the teachers said they could implement. And then she asked the students which ones they preferred. She actually showed them all what it would look like. She did videotapes of this is what the intervention would be like. And then she asked them what they wanted. And they had very clear voice about what they wanted and then what they didn't want. And not surprisingly, the interventions were effective. When she went back to look at the literature, when she was trying to do her lit review, she found no examples. One example where it happened, but they had done it after they had already done the intervention. So the students had to engage with the interventions they didn't want. And it was really amazing because these young people, they were all in middle school. At one point, she was really worried if she was going to get a dissertation because when she went back, she was doing an A-B design. When she went back to her second baseline, the students were like, this is not what I agreed to. I agreed to that other intervention, and I want it back. And it was amazing to hear how strong their voices were and how little we listen to them, okay? So something just to consider. Okay, evaluating solutions, student outcomes, family preferences, cultural norms and beliefs. Okay, so this is where the work begins. Okay, remember you need to talk together. So here's our first case study. So what I want you to do is I'm going to read the case study, and then I want you to talk to someone. I don't care if, you can phone a friend, if you're a cash cab, use a lifeline if you're a cash cab fan, you know what that means. But I want you to talk to somebody about this case study. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to put the process up, and we'll talk more about it. So John works as a BCBA providing early intervention services for children with autism in a low-income rural area. He is the only BCBA within a 100-mile radius of his office. Does anyone here work in that kind of situation? Okay, we have a couple experts. Excellent. Recently, the 2-year-old son of John's neighbor, a single mother of 3 houses down, was diagnosed with autism. The family's pediatrician referred the family to John for ABA services. John is struggling about how to handle the situation. Okay? So here's our process. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and I want you to talk to your neighbors, and then we'll talk through it. Okay? I'm going to set my timer, 5 minutes. Okay, the timer says we're done. So, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, okay. So now I get to be Oprah-like and hopefully get you guys to participate. So, first of all, did you get enough time to discuss this? Awesome. Okay, excellent. We'll do a couple more, just so you know. And again, those of you that are really schedule bound, around 3 o'clock or so, we'll take a break. So, but anyway, so the first step in our process is, why did this trigger my ethical radar? So, for how many of it did it trigger your ethical radar? Okay, does anyone want to share why? Okay.
The fact that they're neighbors. But then again, we don't know what, I mean, is the neighbor just they're passing each other? Is that neighbor 5 miles down the road? How close is that neighbor?
Yeah, okay, so the case study said they were 3 houses down, so they're relatively physically close neighbors, but we don't know how close they are, so, but the idea is that we would be asking this person to engage in a multiple relationship. Right, so that's a clear ethical violation of the code. I don't have my code in front of me, so I can't tell you what number that is, but I'll tell you that is one of the numbers. Does anyone have any other reasons? Oh, yes, ma'am. Oh, wait. Got my steps going. Good.
I'm not sure that I clearly see the multiple relationships. Mainly because, according to your scenario, we didn't know if they even knew each other. I don't know some of my neighbors who live 2 houses away, and I'm assuming they live out in the middle of nowhere, so houses could be a half a mile apart. We don't know if they had any kind of relationship before, and the fact that the pediatrician referred the child to this person without the mom knowing to go directly to this person. And we don't know how good this BCBA would be at establishing the parameters from up front.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, anyone else want to take a stab at just number 1 there? Yeah, oh, okay. That's okay, good.
I unfortunately am going to take a contrarian position, and I don't see any challenge here. I see a rural situation where you're the only game in town. It is not an ethical issue if the contract between the BCBA and the client isn't worked out very carefully. It could become one, but at this point, you have to rely on that person's professionalism.
Okay, well, so we have 2 ways we could go about this now. One is we could just say, not a problem. This is fine if that's okay. Not a problem, and we can move on. Or let's for the sake of discussion, just say that we believe there may be a problem. That that we're super. The agency I run, I am super clear, try to be super clear about boundaries and guidelines and say, okay, this is in fact a problem. So what could be some solutions? What are some things we could brainstorm? Yes.
Again, to kind of piggyback off the comment earlier, due to the formal referral piece of this, that the doctor made the referral, and it wasn't like she came to her neighbor like, hey, you're one of those behavior things, can you help me? I think that you could at least look at it, meet with the person, depending on how well you already know them or any previous relationship, go over the guidelines, see, if you could work something out like this, and if not, at the very least, maybe because it was a referral, take it in, meet with them, and see what other options. I mean, again, it does seem like this person's kind of the only service around, but could you at least look into some kind of teletherapy or making other arrangements if for something came up that you absolutely couldn't do it?
Great. So one idea is to go ahead and have the initial meeting. not ignore the fact that we're neighbors, but make that front and center and talk about what does that mean? How do we keep things in separate lanes? What are the rules that are going to guide our ongoing interactions and relationships?
So I totally agree with what he just said. The only thing that we talked about when we talked about solutions is first maybe doing some research about, like you said, teletherapy. Are there consultants available that could do remote or virtual consultation? And if so, would that be appropriate for this specific client? When you look at client safety, it might be based off of the severity of their challenging behavior. Would that be appropriate or not? But gathering that information, doing some research, then meeting with the parent, like you said, they have their referral, they're coming to you and talk about the options. And then discuss kind of what your solution or outcome will be with the parent. Maybe you're going to discuss the boundaries if that's a possibility. But one other point that we kind of made is, even if there's not a relationship prior to the referral, once you get the referral, if you accept the client, that opens the door, right? They're 2 houses down. What is going to stop them from knocking on your door or calling you in the middle of the night? Or that might open the door to that possibility that would definitely be an ethical situation. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration as well. I know, especially working in parents' homes, that even you're not living in the neighborhood, you might come into some of these situations where they're calling you or they're reaching out for support outside of those parameters. So having them be the neighbor might open the door to more of that type of behavior that would put you in an unethical type situation.
Yeah, or for example, tonight in Seattle is Neighbors Night Out, so every block has a little block barbecue. So if this was in my situation and they live 3 houses down, and even if we'd come up with clear parameters about, if, in case of an emergency, you call this person, you don't, blah, blah, blah. What happens when I'm at the barbecue tonight and I see the child with autism, ripping hot dogs out of the hands of other children who don't have autism, and the person is my client?
Right, and that's going to be the problem for anyone working out of a small town. They're going to run into them at church. They're going to run into them at the general store, the gas station. Their kids go to school with their kids. So we added an idea of possibly having a colleague, obviously at a distance, who would kind of consult to the to the BCBA, just to kind of be this neutral person who would kind of go through their cases, probably all his cases or her cases, because I think they're all potential when you're in a small town like that, just to kind of be that neutral person to kind of say, well, wait a second, maybe you shouldn't go to the church picnic because you're going to run into 10 of your clients.
Okay, so we've now come up with some solutions. We're evaluating solutions based on safety, dignity, et cetera. We make a decision, implement with fidelity. Does anyone have anything else they'd want to add about this particular case? Okay.
I think one of the things you have to consider, because it is a rural community as well, is what the parents' abilities are. If you're looking at doing some type of remote consultation with the BCBA, because I did work in a very rural area as a teacher for 6 years, and a lot of the parents that I worked with, I really needed to be in the home to explain things to them and make sure I could explain it enough times and in the right ways, just based on their education. No judgment, just that's what they'd done, and I needed to be able to show them things specifically in multiple ways so that they understood it. So I think you have to take that into consideration when you're deciding what to do, and it is part of the safety for the client and just the effectiveness of treatment.
The match between the intervention and the client is always important. We can't just assume that because something is an evidence-based practice or has been demonstrated in one place that's going to work with someone else. There he is. Okay.
I was going to say the other issue that we came up with as a small group was the issue of contract and payment. If this is a single parent, you're going to have to figure out something that's going to work in terms of reimbursement, or it's not a professional contract.
That's a great point. So we're going to hopefully hope that in this case, their insurance pays and we don't have to deal with that. But that's a very good point, because we don't want to get into that situation of, trying to barter something. That can be very challenging, difficult, if not spelled out with extreme caution. So any final comments on this one before we go on to our next case? Okay. So every time I do these, I get new ideas. So, okay, this is, I only wish was not a real case, but we're going to do the same thing. So Sylvia is a BCBA that works for a school district. She was recently called to consult on a case where the teacher was sending children to sit in a closet when they were acting out. The teacher stated this wasn't seclusion because the closet door was unlocked. The teacher reported that she has tried everything and nothing worked, as well as being able to tell the children that if they did not shape up, they would have to spend time in the closet. The teacher said she's been using this technique for 20 years and she has never had a complaint. Sylvia is not sure where to begin with this teacher. So what do you advise? And again, what are the ethical issues here? Not necessarily, I'm not asking you where you would begin necessarily, but what are, based on the code, are some of our ethical issues. Here's our process. Again, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and we'll get back in touch in 5 minutes, okay? I don't mind walking around. I kind of like it, if you don't mind. Yeah. Yeah, no, I still have 5,000 steps to get there. So I'm fine, actually. But thank you, Janet. I appreciate it. Okay. Now if I can figure out how to turn off my timer. Okay. How many of you have dealt with something like this in real life? Unfortunately, way too many. Okay, so what are some of the first ethical, where does this begin ethically? Okay. So whether the door is locked or not, it is seclusion. Totally separate. But the big issue is we're using a punitive measurement versus a positive method for trying to keep the kid engaged in what they are supposed to be engaged in. The fact that she doesn't see anything wrong, and she's been doing it for 20 years, is an issue, but they need to approach it with her and talk to her about it first and try and rectify the situation with her doing something, a positive program in place versus this punitive measurement of removing the child. Okay, so one of the very first issues comes up is it's a punitive and you're supposed to always use reinforcement before you get to a punitive measure. Are there any other issues that before that we get there? I know, woohoo!
Well, the first thing I think of, this is in the school. So where's the principal? Where are the rules in the school? If the behavior specialist, the BCBA, is hired by the school, then I think the first thing I would do is approach the person in charge to find out what I should do. I mean, there's rules, and if this woman's been doing this, if the teacher's been doing this for 20 years, well, you know, somebody's negligent.
And then also, there's a part of the code that states that behavior analysts got to abide by federal and state law. In many states, this is seclusion and illegal, and so it's breaking the law.
Okay, I see you over here.
And I think this goes back to a prior slide of yours, of the question of who's the client. This is is it the principal? Is it the school? Has a parent complained? Is it the teacher? Who is this BCBA working for?
I think that's one of the places I would want to start is why are you there? And what is your purpose being there? So for example, if let's say I'm a BCBA who works for a family and I was called in to look at consult on another child in the classroom, but I observed this going on. This is a really sticky situation because that is not my client. That is not, we know now that we are all mandated reporters, and so I think that we would be mandated reporters of seclusion without permission, which we would want to take care of, but the issue always becomes, who is our client? Is the teacher our client? Is the principal our client? Is the child our client? And then another thing that hasn't come up yet is this issue of, did we do an assessment? And again, we're not going to suggest that this is the appropriate behavioral intervention, but we can't opine about a behavior until we've done an assessment. And that's one of the areas where sometimes we get ourselves in trouble with teachers is, we're in the classroom, we're observing student A, and student B is causing the ruckus in the corner, and they say, can't you just give me a tip about student B? And you want to say, yes, here's my 10 pages of tips that I could give you, but ethically I can't do that, because I haven't observed them with consent. I have no right to do that. And it's different if I'm an employee of the school, right? Because then you have the right to do that. But if you're not an employee of the school, it becomes a way stickier kind of issue. Okay? What other comments do people have about this particular case? How we might go forward? Things you'd want to think about? Yes.
Thank you. Sometimes when you walk into a school, I feel like just because somebody's been doing it for 20 years, they might not know a better way to do it. And I've had it happen. So sometimes you just kind of have to walk in and not be quick to judge. Sometimes it's hard to not. I'm working on my poker face. But it's not great, especially when I see things like that. But I think it happens because it used to be okay. So a teacher's in charge. Teacher needs to do what they've been doing. It used to work. It doesn't work anymore. So it's trying to build trust and then say, oh, well, maybe we can come up with some better ways. I think it's helpful when you come in as a person that works for the school of the person you're going to see, because I've also had it happen when I worked in an outside agency and you're coming into a school and the teacher sees you as someone that goes right back to the parent, even though that in that situation the client is still your primary concern and you're consulting in the school setting, but there's no kind of ownership over you. You're just like an independent party. So if you work for the district or the place with the same person, then it's easier to have a discussion that doesn't feel like judgment, and then you can try and work out a solution as opposed to saying like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go back and this person's going to report what they saw. And it just, the trust, I think, is a little bit easier.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that one of the issues that comes up is this whole issue of the social ecology of schools, and then the cultural fit and the contextual fit there. And again, not that it's ever okay to do that, but to think about why that may have been shaped up. One of the things that I think is always interesting about behavior analysts is that we're so careful in thinking about how the behavior of the children and students with disabilities and clients with disabilities that we may be working with may be shaped up, but not as careful or considerate about how the behavior of the caregivers is shaped up, because clearly that behavior on her part has been reinforced, if not over 20 years, over some amount of time. And so we have to think about what was happening there.
We had kind of talked also, piggybacking off of that, about just that you kind of get some literature together to help re-educate the teacher and ask her what interventions she's tried, because she said nothing's worked. So ask what interventions, and then kind of come back and take some data and assess the different interventions. And so instead of just telling her she's wrong, provide her with additional education and then help support other interventions to see what else you could do in that setting.
Thank you. I think that idea of partnership is so important.
I'm going to again bring it back to the rural situation. I live in West Virginia, and you've got to consider what the culture of the school is. I've spoken with parents near who live in the Eastern Panhandle whose children were locked in closets or strapped onto chairs to deal with behavior problems a year ago, 6 months ago. And it's okay in their schools. It happens on a daily basis to these kids. And so going in, you would have to be looking at altering the entire concept within the whole school system, not just within that one classroom. And the parents know that it's not right, but they don't know what alternatives are, and they agree with the teachers during stuff because they don't know what else to do. They don't know any options. So, whole other issue.
Great point. Other comments before we move on? We'll do one more case study. Comment? You sure?
One of the questions that I had was who drove the referral? Like we were talking about who is the client, because I know where I work, some of the very experienced teachers, even though the BCBAs work for the districts, the teachers are not receptive to suggestions because, you know, I've been teaching for 20 years. They're not going to tell me how to do my job. So if they didn't ask for that consultation, they're often not going to be receptive, even if they are working for the same employer. So it gets tough, especially for a newer BCBA to come in and try to make these suggestions. They're not going to be well received.
And especially for a BCBA or anybody, any consultant who only thinks that their way is the only right way to do things. So like I said, we'll do one more case. Let me look at what we got here. Okay. So I just want to show this quote just because I think this, I love this quote, and we're going to be talking about an article that Alan Nuringer wrote after our break. And I think his point here is that the point here is a general one, because X is valid or functional does not mean that Y or X are invalid or functional. And I think that that's a really important case when we start working, like especially in this, even in this case of where, yeah, it's not appropriate to put a child in the closet, but maybe it has been working for them, or in some case it's been reinforced. Her behavior has been reinforced. So we have to acknowledge that as we move forward. So we'll do this one case because it's kind of, I think it happens to us all the time. So again, Drew is a BCBA in a large urban district. At the school where Drew works, staff are assigned to a 4-person interdisciplinary team that consists of an educator, BCBA, speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, and a social worker. Other members are brought onto the team as needed. One of Drew's colleagues, who is an occupational therapist on the team, recently attended a workshop on sensory integration and now wants to integrate some of the sensory integration activities, such as providing deep pressure, sitting on a ball, into the activities at the center. Many of the children seem to enjoy these activities, and now therapists want to implement these strategies more broadly. Drew is worried about how to navigate this situation. He recently read a study that showed no effect of these sensory integration activities. What advice do you give Drew? And I'm sure this is something we've all dealt with. So again, we'll do 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so I like that we ended on this particular case study because this is going to get us into our next section of the talk. But how would we start? Why does this trigger, or first of all, does it trigger your ethical radar, and if so, why? Okay, thank you.
As behavior analysts, we rely on scientifically based interventions, and right up there it says, I think it said it somewhere, that OT, there is no scientific evidence supporting this. So right there would trigger an ethical dilemma there. Thank you. So right there, but what we talked about is also knowing our ethical codes, opening ourselves to knowing OT's ethical codes and being able to collaborate with them in a way to form a more, I guess, a broader intervention for this person, the individual with whom we work with.
So you raise a great point, which is that although there's not great evidence about sensory integration to date, there's also important information that when teams work together in a collegial way, that the children's overall, the client's overall outcome is enhanced. And so how do we balance this idea of saying we must do only behavioral intervention and at the same time annoying or disenfranchising the rest of the team? So any other comments? What are some solutions we could have? Okay. I'm going to reinforce first-time hand raisers. Awesome. Thank you.
So our team kind of came up with 2 points. The first was, if we wanted to, we can say, since the kids enjoy it, it can be sort of implemented as a reinforcement. Or another thing that we could do is, if the rest of the team is dead set on using this, but we don't necessarily have the evidence for it, we could do an intervention where we say, okay, well, for these 2 weeks, we'll try it your way, collect the data, then we do it our way and compare data. That way they can kind of see, is this working, is it not working, and we'll have more input.
We could create our own evidence base. Excellent. Yes.
The other day I was in a school, and in the bathroom there was this sign that said, an intervention without data is simply an activity. So we could kind of present it in that way, like, oh, this sounds like a great idea. Are we looking at it as an intervention or as an activity? I'm sure all the kids would love it. So that might kind of help the data collection aspect, but I thought it was a great quote.
That's great. Okay.
So if you're the BCBA, I guess I don't really see what the issue is here. This is a team approach, and the OT is the one making these recommendations. I work in a school where there's a sensory room, and the OT says sensory shouldn't be something that they work for. It's something that they need. So why can't you just do both?
We work together, and my viewpoint was the same. I think it's a little bit different because occupational therapy going into the sensory is more of the behavioral. I mean, we wouldn't go to the speech language pathologist and question their area of expertise. If they had a stuttering program, I wouldn't ask them if their stuttering program was evidence-based. I would assume they're a professional and they would be recommending what they thought was best. As long as it wasn't interrupting with any kind of therapy, if I was doing a toilet training protocol and they wanted to take them out to bounce on a ball during that, then I think I would have a discussion. But I mean, there's no harm to the child. It's maybe not creating any benefit, but there's no harm. And we do a lot of flexible seating. I mean, that's just the norm in our school district.
Well, we've actually published a study on flexible seating, and I think it's been really effective. And I would argue that the ergonomic industry that makes billions of dollars a year would also argue that appropriate and well-fit seating is good. My issues around it come up when. So what if I'm the OT and I take someone out, contingent on challenging behavior? Like, I have no problem with non-contingent sensory reinforcement or contingent sensory reinforcement. It's just when it's contingent on challenging behavior.
That's what I was going to say. So I was just going to say that I work in a school, a non-public school, and we work in a multidisciplinary team. And so we run into this situation often. And it's kind of dependent on the OT, on the other members. So a few years back, we had an OT, and they would put a sensory diet in for a kid, and there would be no schedule, and there would be no kind of parameters. So a lot of times the kid would want the ball or was extra active, and so when the kid would cry would be when the access to the sensory activity would happen. So we talked about taking data and making sure that we're taking data to determine if there is a difference in the sensory state prior to the sensory activity versus after the sensory activity. And then we also talked about, we had kind of like a work group to kind of determine when is the sensory activity or the equipment a reinforcer for not every kid, but for this particular kid and these activities for this other kid, versus a sensory need that needs to be addressed. And that sensory need should be addressed prior to problem behavior. So when you're seeing some of those precursor behaviors with the extra movement or inability to sit still and things of that nature, versus after they've started having problem behaviors.
I think it also said that she went to a workshop. This occupational therapist went to one sensory workshop. And I think she might need a little more information than that if she was going to be working and really saying that this was going to be very helpful. And I kind of agree with you where I've had problems with OTs, and not the newer OTs. I think these are the ones maybe 10 years ago that have been doing it for a long time. But they seem to feel that the cause of all children with autism's problem behavior was sensory. And so what they would end up doing is we would be working to using a behavioral technique to try to modify that behavior, and they would be strengthening it. So that was really the issue, I think, and as long as that's not happening. But I would want to make real sure somebody didn't go to one workshop and decide they were a sensory master.
Excellent point. Okay, any other comments about this particular case study? Okay, then hearing none, it's 3:03, so let's take a break, and I'm going to start talking again at 3:15. So you get a 12-minute break. So, okay. Okay, I like to be on time, so I said I would start at 3:15, so we're starting at 3:15, and people I know are still filing in. So So I'm going to change, we're going to change paths a little bit here, change directions a little bit here. And, you know, I would say that there have been 3 parts of this presentation. The first part, we kind of talked about the history of the code and ethics in general and what that means. In the second part of the presentation, we talked about some case studies and the problem-solving strategy for looking at cases. And now in this third part, we're going to take a deep dive into one particular code element. And you may wonder why I picked this one. And it was just because I think it's one that we don't talk about that often, but I think it's really important. To be fair, truth in advertising, I've never done this part of the talk before, so I'm just a little bit nervous. So we'll see how it goes, but we'll figure this out together. So this idea of kind of taking a deep dive into one segment of the code goes back to this issue of ethical fitness, and this idea that if this code is a living document and it's a document that we use to make decisions with, then we need to be aware of it and we need to read it seriously and thoroughly and really question the things in the text and understand all components of the text. So there's one part of the code that talks about public statements. And on first glance, you know, it seems like public statements, there's no big deal. Public statements, don't lie. I mean, you know, like how much more detail do we need to say than like be truthful, don't lie, don't plagiarize, right? You know, couldn't we just get it down, distill it down to those few things? But the code is way more detailed and technical and brings up some questions that are that I think merit some discussion. So 8.0, and again, if you have your code handy, you can follow along. It says that behavior analysts comply with this code in public statements relating to their professional services, products, or publications, or to the profession of behavior analysis. Public statements include, but are not limited to, paid or unpaid advertising. You know, we can talk about that if we want to. Brochures, printed matters, directory listings, personal resumes, curriculum vitae, interviews or comments for use in the media, statements in legal proceedings, lectures, and public presentations, social media, and published materials. So what I'm doing right now is considered a public statement, and you know, I hope that it's adhering to this code. And if not, I have a good reason why it's not. So, but we'll move forward and not go there. So the one area of the code I want to talk about specifically is 8.01b, where it says that behavior analysts should avoid making false or deceptive statements. Again, at face value, it's like, what's the problem here? You know, like, isn't this like apple pie and ice cream? Of course, who could disagree with not making deceptive statements? You know, it's kind of a non-starter. But then let's read this deeply. Let's read this seriously. So it says, behavior analysts do not implement behavior analytic interventions. Non-behavior analytic intervention services may only be provided within the context of non-behavioral analytic education, formal training, and credentialing. So I'm assuming that means that if I am trained as a SLP and a behavior analyst, that if I am doing the stuttering intervention that someone referred to earlier, and it's a non-behavioral behavior analytic intervention, I can do that, okay? But then there's other stuff that says, but I have to be careful to tell people that's not behavior analytic, and I'm not mixing the two. But let's then go back to this idea of what does it mean to be a behavior analytic intervention. What is a behavioral intervention? Okay. Now, again, this is one of those kind of things, and remember, I spend my time living at a university, so I will take all the, all the criticisms that go on to that, that maybe we're thinking this through too deeply. But what is a behavioral intervention? Okay, so let's go back to the sensory intervention chair issue we were talking about. So I have a doc student who a few years ago did a dissertation. She did a couple studies as a doc student, and they involved sitting kids on therapy balls, and she did beautiful. The data are gorgeous, and she did A/B reversal designs, beautiful behavioral documentation of an intervention. To show that, in fact, the on-task behavior, both of children with autism and typically developing children in fourth grade classrooms who had been referred because they had high rates of off-task. For both groups of children, the behavior increased when they were sitting on balls, and in fact, the children preferred sitting on balls to the other options. Okay? Is that a behavioral intervention? I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that. It was an intervention that was evaluated behaviorally, but so does that make it a behavioral intervention? So let's go to the scholars and see what the scholars have to say about this. So there's a white paper out by APBA, the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, and they say that, and the purpose of this white paper is to define what a behavioral intervention is, and they say that genuine ABA interventions have all the defining characteristics of ABA and are designed and overseen by appropriately credentialed professionals. Okay, so something cannot be, by their definition says, if I am doing something that is a behavioral intervention, but I don't have a BCBA, it is not by definition a behavioral intervention. Okay? And then they say that they all behavioral interventions have to apply to the Bear, Wolf, and Risley Big Seven. Applied, conceptually systematic, behavioral, analytic, effective, technological, and yield effective outcomes. Okay? So when thinking about my kids who were sitting on the balls, did it fit this criteria? Well, I think I was probably at the time an appropriately credentialed professional. I'm not sure it was conceptually systematic, because did I know what principle was in place that was causing or was responsible for the functional relation of a change in behavior when and only when the child sat on the ball? I'm not sure I know that. But to be honest with you, and I hope I don't get, people throwing tomatoes at me for saying this, I'm not sure I care. And because it saw, as I think one of the other parts of being a behavior analyst that I adhere to is, and I think I'm sitting in a room of pragmatists. As behavior analysts, one of the things I personally love about applied behavior analysis is that pragmatism is a part of science to which we adhere to, and we are inherently problem solvers. And another part of behavior analysis that I think is extremely important is that as a profession, we are an inherently optimistic profession. So the profession, as a group of behavior analysts, we don't go in and say, ooh, that's bad. We say, oh, there's a problem. Let's analyze it. We can fix that problem. Okay, so So there's one dilemma. I'm going to hold that dilemma right up here on this shoulder. Now, according to Cooper, Heron, and Heward, or as we like to refer to them, the White Book, they they say that behavior analysis has other things that we have to do. For example, it needs to be accountable. It needs to be public. And I'm assuming by what they mean by that is that we can see it. Okay, it's not a private thing. I'm not thinking it through. I can see it. It's doable, and I think by that means they mean it's sustainable. It's empowering, and it's optimistic. Again, all things I adhere to. But I'm here to ask questions and be the naysayer right now. So I'm going to say, what about that 10-second DRO that we prescribe? Anyone here ever suggested a teacher or that someone do a 10-second DRO? No, I'm the only one in the whole audience who's ever suggested that someone get reinforced at a rate of every 10 seconds. I certainly have gone into classrooms where that's on the kids' behavior plan, that they are being reinforced every 10 seconds. Is that doable? No. It's kind of like one of my actual favorite interventions. I guess you're really a behavioral geek when you start having favorite interventions. And so that's me. So one of my favorite interventions is actually time delay, as a way of teaching, fading out prompts. Is time delay is written by Mark Rollery. And one of the things that he always wrote about was this distinction between progressive time delay and consistent time delay. So progressive time delay is where you go from a 5-second time delay or a 1-second time delay to a 3-second time delay to a 5-second time delay. And I've always said, I know no teacher outside of Mark's lab where they can consistently distinguish between a 1-second time delay and a 5-second time delay. I don't think it can be done in a classroom. So does that make it a behavioral intervention if it's not doable? Okay. Would we say that escape extinction, a strategy that's used in many feeding clinics, where you just don't take away a bite? If a child's trying to avoid taking a bite, you don't take away the bite. Is that a doable intervention? Not by most people. I would argue it's not. Does it make it a not behavioral intervention? I don't know. I'm just asking the question. Because when we ask these questions, it causes us to think differently and more deeply about these issues, this relatively simple question that we started with of what is a behavioral intervention, okay? So, but similarly, we go back to Bear, Wolf, and Risley because they taught us a lot. And Bear, Wolf, and Risley say that applied research is constrained to examining behaviors which are socially important rather than convenient for study. And that keeps us thinking about that, when they talked about the fact that we should not be in the laboratory, and one might question whether or not the new laboratory is the bonus room in parents' homes, but, where in fact are we applying applied behavior analysis, a big question. And further, behaviorism and pragmatism often seem to go hand in hand. Applied research is eminently pragmatic. It asks how it is possible to get an individual to do something effectively. So it doesn't say there, and I think this is a really important point for us to think about. So if our question goes back to, having a child sit in a classroom in a way that's not disruptive. And the most effective way to do that is to let him sit on a therapy ball. It seems to me that Beowulf and Risley might argue that's a behavioral intervention, assuming I can demonstrate that that the behavior changes when and only when I implement the independent variable. So, not conceptually consistent, but proven behaviorally. So, what does that mean? What does that mean for all of us as we go forward and think about what behavioral interventions are? So, I'm going to make you guys do some more work. So I want you to think about these interventions. I bet most of you have used all or some of these interventions. But I want you to, I'm going to give you again 5 minutes. And I want you to just pick one, at least start with one in your group, and think about, are these behavioral interventions? And I'm going to put back on the list, well, I'll leave that here, but I want you to think about, we'll go, when we start talking about them, we'll talk about the 7 essential characteristics of applied behavior analysis. But I just want you to talk about them and then let us talk about them as a group, okay? So actually, since there are 7 elements, I'll give you 7 minutes on this one. So, okay, we'll come back as a group in a minute. Okay. Okay. Do we need more time? We're good? Okay. So I need a few more steps, so I need to add another walking thing to this presentation. Okay, so does this make sense? What is a behavioral intervention? Who wants to share? Who would like to opine?
I think it's a great question. So when I think about the field, 30, 40 years ago when you and I started, we mostly were consequence-based. It was really obvious. It was tokens, it was timeout, it was punishment procedures. We didn't have this discussion. Now that we're dealing with antecedent AOs, MOs, EOs, that opens up a million possibilities, including bouncy balls, sensory integration. And so I could be heretical. Hopefully you guys won't throw me out, but I would say if it's empirical, if it's studied using a single subject design in a consistent way, it could be considered behavioral. And that would open it up to your dilemma with your graduate student doing the ball. But to me, that was a behavioral. By that, it fit the definition because of how it was examined. So as long as we hold to that truth, that if we're looking for the truth, we may not even know why that ball worked or why sensory integration works. I don't think it does, but maybe it does for some kids. In some cases, I'm an empiricist first. If putting that kid on the ball works, I can't say, oh, well, it's not behavioral, so I'm not going to use it. It's empirical. As long as I can prove it, it should fit our model.
Who else? Anyone else have a So what if it's not conceptually consistent? Does that matter? And what does conceptual consistency mean?
Yeah, I think it would matter, and I said out of all of them, I think the conceptually systematic and then also the technological or the big ones with this kind of stuff, because you can do things and you can get results and you can get amazing, socially significant, life-changing results, but if you can't explain how you did it, if you can't tie it back to basic principles and you can't replicate it and help others to do it, you know, that's great that you got the results in that one situation, but then, you know, how do you replicate it and how can you be sure without a shadow of a doubt that it was your intervention that actually did that, or are we missing other variables? So you might have other people trying to replicate what you did and completely missing the mark. So I think that's a big problem with that one.
So I totally agree with you, and I want to just push back a little bit. The technological, I totally get. Replication is core to science. But I'm getting stuck. I didn't think I would be, but I'm getting stuck on conceptual consistent because I don't know what are the principles. That's where I'm getting stuck on what are the principles with which we need to be conceptually consistent or systematic. Sorry.
That's the part that we were talking about, because I think we can pick out bits and pieces of each one, but can we agree on, because I think it makes me uncomfortable to not have agreement in terms of following the dimensions. So if we don't have 80% of the dimensions, is it out? I mean, because I think conceptually systematic, I mean, I can find a little bit to each or kind of tweak it, like, oh, incidental teaching could be generalized by doing this and this and this, but I feel like we're kind of fishing to make it fit to be a team player, but because I feel like we sometimes get, as behavior analysts, I should say, mixed messages. Like we come in trailblaze, like hardcore, like these are our principles and we're sticking to them, and then we get to a meeting and we're not exactly come across as agreeable, and so we try and be agreeable, and then there's this inflexibility that comes, because in looking at these, I think we're the most uncomfortable in this group with social stories, but moving forward, I think that the conceptually systematic part, can we say, oh, well, okay, maybe differential reinforcement, but how? When we're talking about a couple of these things, but I couldn't say the whole list would be covered by all. So should I be hardcore and say they're all out? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, that's how this list came about. I mean, we were talking about them, and like I'm easier with incidental teaching, Hart and Risley demonstrated that pretty thoroughly in 1968, but social stories, I don't know why. I don't know the system of why they're supposed to work.
On the issue of conceptual systematic issues, the ability to tie what you're doing to the basic principles of behavior and reinforcement is where you get conceptual systematic. It doesn't have to be a full explanation that you understand this completely. EOs and MOs existed long before Jack Michael described them in detail, and to a point where it was hard to follow. So.
Some would argue still is.
Absolutely.
I think for all of these, if we can really carefully isolate the behavior that we're measuring, it's easier to kind of look at how this all fits in. Even with social stories, what is the behavior we're looking to change? I think a lot of times behavior analysts just come in and say, oh, where's the data? Well, sticking with that. But if you kind of take it back and look at what behavior you're looking to change, it's easier to kind of fit it into this type of a framework. I don't have the answer for social stories, but really, I kind of do. Each social story is supposed to change a certain behavior. So if you can document whether that intervention changed that behavior, you can, it kind of does tap into the conceptual systematic nature.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that other people are grappling with this too, and that I'm just not, that Nancy and I are just not specifically kind of dumb about this. So I'll be happy to report back.
So I kind of envision that conceptually systematic is going back to the literature, because we are still a new field. So if you're looking at just saying the principles, okay, well, that's probably going to change before we're done practicing. They're going to add on, they're going to clarify. Right now, relational frame theory is having this resurgence related to acceptance and commitment therapy. So, who's to say in 10, 15 more years, they're not going to go and say, well, behavior analysts can do acceptance and commitment therapy. That would never cross our minds right now. So going back to the literature that's there and consistent now, I think helps with that conceptually systematic. One of the things we talked about was the National Autism Standards Project, and how that shows things that are currently found to be effective or not effective or emerging. So relying on those pieces to say these are our current kind of principles, I think is how I make that kind of work.
And I think that's a great point, but again, that gets us to a point of whose literature do we accept, right? Because those are not necessarily behavioral strategies. And so, but I think that there are things we all use, exercise as an antecedent intervention. I think many of us use that. It's good evidence on it. Makes good sense to all of us. Many of us think we feel better personally after we've worked out. But what's the, where are we on those kinds of issues? I think that the issue that I want to raise and I want to highlight through this discussion is that these are exactly the kind of conversations that as behavior analysts we need to be having, so that we don't go into IEP meetings and say, or BIP meetings or whatever meetings we go to because of our because of the people with whom we work and say, I'm sorry, that's not on my list. That's not behavioral. And I think that Ben really, to me, nailed it, which is that we don't know what is behavioral, not behavioral. In fact, do we mean effective when we say behavioral? And if we can demonstrate, you know, that something is effective and that we can control and demonstrate its effectiveness using good experimental design, is that the case? Now, I think back to when I was in graduate school, and we used to call people who did that methodological behaviorists, and it was like the harshest insult that we could give each other. You know, it's like, oh my gosh. And now people are like, what are you talking about, right? But I do think that there's something about that, you know, that we have this amazingly strong way to demonstrate effect, and we should be using it more to open our strategies, because I think someone over there said this, is that we're going to probably have lots more interventions that we use, let's hope, in the next 5 years than we're using now. So I have a few concluding comments. Okay. So I just want you to think about this. We're not going to discuss this, and these, I'm going to send these codes, these slides to John as soon as I'm done here, so that you'll be able to look at this in more detail if you want. But this was just another discussion item if you and your colleagues want to think about it. So we think about this woman, Amelia, who's a BCBA, and notices that her kids, the kids with whom she works, make more vocalizations when she's in the pool. She's also a swim instructor. Can she co-treat? So something to talk about. Not going to talk about it now. Okay, so recently I reread an article that, if you haven't read, another thing to add to your summer reading list, by Alan Nuringer, and it's called The Humble Behaviorist. And if you can't find it, my email is on these slides, and I'd be happy to send you a copy, as long as you don't use it for more than your own pleasure, because that would be unethical of me to do that. So anyway, but he talks about, this was a really great article, because one of the things that, to me, it was a great article, because one of the things that has come up kind of in our conversation, maybe not directly, but at least indirectly, is this idea that sometimes behavior analysts aren't the best team players. And, we're kind of known, unfortunately, as that. And so I think that his comment to say a scientific stance that all knowledge is provisional and that one's most deeply held positions must be continually reconsidered is really helpful. That, the data are the data, and that what we need to look at is empiricism. And then I love this quote from Sidman, and that just goes to show that I was old, so I had to read Sidman in graduate school. But I think it's a really great quote, and he says, "The student should have some convictions as to what kind of data are most needed by science. That will give direction to his research and provide it with an overall unity that will permit him to make a sounder contribution." This is the important part. "But he should never be so self-centered in his convictions that he ignores methodologically sound data that arise from other points of view. And as his science progresses, he must be able to change the directions of his research with new developments." And I hope that behavior analysts will take to heart what Sidman said, because I think that will only help our science grow. We have so many more kids with autism, and we have many more behavior analysts, but we have many more other people who work with people with autism than behavior analysts. And part of our job is to ensure that we're doing the work to keep the field growing and to make sure that all people get access to free and appropriate public education, because that's the one entitlement that all children, all students have. 2 more quotes, and then I promise you, maybe 3, 2, just 2. Okay, so then Nuringer goes on to say, until the evidence is in, humble agnosticism may be more functional than adherence to any position. So, like, let's not speak beyond the data. And then he goes on to say that a humble behaviorist goal is to discover laws and solve problems together whenever possible with colleagues from different fields. So why aren't we, so rather than, arguing with the OT, we need to be working with the OT. Rather than to prove the correctness of his or her own field or philosophical commitment. If humble behavioral practices yield scientific and social progress, they will survive the test of time. So just some closing final thoughts here is that engaging in ethical practice requires ongoing thought, study, and action. You need to be ethically fit. Consider what it means to be ethically fit, and as much as I don't like this term, set up your own professional learning community or group of people that, your drinking group that goes out and talks about ethics, as geeky as that is. Whatever you do, have people that you can talk to about that. Make a plan about how you're going to do that, and then be thoughtful, be humble, and behavior is all around us, so let's learn from it. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Okay, I just wanted to remind folks about the panel discussion that will take place from 4:30 to roughly 6 o'clock. And the code for this session is MAW, M-A-W 124. Again, that's M-A-W 124.